Well, good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be here and celebrate your contributions to our science and congratulate you for this wonderful prize. It turns out that when I was looking for a PhD, it was a time when you were analyzing the first Herbie data. And I read your work, and I found this work so inspiring and interesting that I decided to carry on this subject, and 30 years later, here we are. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to give you an idea of how the field of the impact of, like that, the role of clouds in climate has evolved with time. Maybe we need to do something. Okay. So I'd like to tell you what progress our community has done in this field, but also what are the current challenges. And like for the black carbon and other aspects of our science, there are still many challenges in our field. The science is not done yet. So Ram, you've made so many contributions understanding and quantifying the impact of different constituents on the Earth radiation budget. And you did that through radiative calculations, of course, by organizing field experiments, but also by analyzing satellite observations. And in particular, okay, so I should remove this, maybe? Can you hear me? Good. And especially, you talked already about this Earth radiation budget experiment, this satellite mission that had been designed to measure the radiation budget with a good accuracy. Is it okay? Yeah, I still need that. And in 1989, Ram published this very important paper. What should I do? No, okay. I don't know. You can keep talking. Okay, I keep talking. So before this paper, we knew, of course, that clouds had two antagonist effects on their radiation budget. On the one hand, okay. They were reflecting sunlight and had a cooling effect on climate, and they also contributed to the greenhouse effect, and so they also had a warming effect on climate. And we didn't know how important was this two effects. Maybe we'll manage. Yeah. Okay. And then Herbie observations came up, and then we had. We could measure the impact of clouds on the shortwave radiation and the longwave radiation. We could see that this effect was very much depending on the cloud type in presence, and it was varying with seasons and so on. And for the first time, we could measure the fact that on average over the whole planet, all cloud types, then the clouds were cooling the planet by quite a large number. 20 watt per meter square. It's a lot. And so it made us realize that even a small change in cloud amount or in cloud properties could make this cooling stronger or weaker. And then the change in cloud with warming could produce climate feedback, potentially strong climate feedbacks. So this work was really, really important. And in the same year, Ram published another paper taking advantage of the clear sky measurements of radiative fluxes from Herbie and showing that for the first time that this close relationship between temperature, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, and the clear sky greenhouse effect, and showing also that water vapor was increasing with temperature. And so it was also very important work because it was telling us that we could study climate feedbacks not only with models, but also using observations and global observations. So that was very inspiring. And during the same year, there was another very important study that was published. I don't remember if Ram, you were on it or not, but it was from Bob Sess, and you were very close to him. And Bob Sess organized the first model intercomparison, where a same perturbation was imposed to the models. The surface temperature of the ocean was warmed up by a uniform amount, and he looked at the radiative response to this perturbation. And from this, he quantified what we call the sensitivity parameter that was related. I don't touch it. And he showed that the sensitivity parameter estimated from the different models was quite consensual in clear sky, but the response in cloudy sky was differing a lot across the models. And so that was really the first evidence. Well, there was already the China report mentioning this 10 years earlier, but with so many models, it was the first time that it was shown that the response of clouds to warming was such a big uncertainty for the estimate of climate sensitivity. And then the fact that all the studies were published during the same year showed that having the opportunity to study the impact of clouds on the Earth radiation budget with data was very, very important, because we could then try to assess what the models were doing. 20 years later, there's still a big uncertainty in the climate sensitivity, so the amount of warming associated with a given increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. And nowadays, there are still a huge uncertainty across the models on this. But nowadays, we are in better position to interpret where this uncertainty comes from. And we could decompose, for instance, this warming and show that, in response to a doubling of CO2, we have about 1 degree warming coming from the radiative effect of CO2 and the associated Planck response. And we have an additional 1 degree warming coming from the increase of water vapor with temperature that amplifies the warming. We have an additional contribution to the warming coming from the melting snow and ice at the surface. And the rest is related to the response of clouds. And as you can see on this plot, really the contribution of cloud feedbacks to the climate sensitivity is by far the largest source of uncertainty across model results. So what progress have we made over those years, and what kind of advances? First of all, we tried to better understand where this cloud feedback uncertainty was coming from. And there are many different cloud types on Earth. And so one thing that we wanted to figure out is whether this big uncertainty was coming more from the response of low clouds or high clouds, or whether it was coming from changes in the cloud amount or in cloud properties, cloud phase, and so on. And what we've shown is that most of this uncertainty for decades has been dominated by the low cloud feedback, so the response of low-level clouds to warming. And there are different types of low clouds. There are stratus, stratocumulus clouds, trade cumulus clouds. And we've shown that trade cumulus clouds were playing a very important role in this uncertainty, not because they are the most, the clouds that reflect solar radiation the most, but because the trade cumulus are really the cloud type which is the most frequent on Earth, and therefore a slight change in their property can have a huge impact on the global Earth radiation budget. Many years later, this paper by Tim Myers from San Diego tried to estimate the low cloud feedback, both from observations and using models. And so what he shows first is that the low cloud feedback is thought to be a positive feedback, an amplifying feedback. And he looked at this feedback in different low cloud regimes. So in mid-latitudes, the estimates from observations are in blue. And you see that, and he compared these estimates with model results from 2 generations of models. So the SEMI5 models were quite underestimating this feedback quite a lot, but in the most in the more recent generation of models, the things have improved, and that's partly related to the fact that the microphysical representation of clouds has been improved in models. There is a better representation of supercooled droplets in particular, and that improves the magnitude of the feedback. But if you look at other local regimes, in particular in the stratocumulus regimes, there is a huge discrepancy between models and observations, with models underestimating this feedback very strongly. We'll come back to that later in the presentation. In the trade cumulus regime, you'll see that, contrary to the stratocumulus regime, the models tend to overestimate the feedback associated with trade cumulus quite a lot. And the other very striking result is that, here, there is a huge spread across the model results. And as I was saying earlier, the feedback in trade cumulus was really, for a long time, the dominant cause for this large uncertainty in climate sensitivity across the models. And then this motivated a lot of research in our community, and it was shown that this huge uncertainty in trade cumulus feedback was coming primarily from the response of the cloudiness near the cloud-based level. The response of cloud fraction at this level to changes in environmental properties. So then it meant that we needed to understand further what controls this cloud fraction near the cloud-based level. And that's one of the reasons why we've organized a field campaign near Barbados over the Atlantic Ocean. That was the Eureka field campaign. And we used many observing platforms, research aircraft, research vessels, drones, and so on. And in particular, with 2 research aircraft flying in coordination, we could really measure in great details all the environmental conditions in which the clouds were forming, and also characterize the cloud properties themselves. And I'm going to try to summarize very simply some of the things that we've learned from this Eureka field campaign. You can think of trade cumulus to be to result from both thermodynamical and dynamical processes. By thermodynamical processes, you can think of the influence of environmental humidity and the amount of cloudiness. By dynamical processes, you can think of all those vertical motions that take place at the small scale, but also at the mesoscale, that contribute to lift air and to form clouds. And what we've learned from Eureka is that the control of trade cumulus by dynamical processes was much more important than the control by thermodynamical processes. And in particular, the role of thermals and mesoscale circulations in controlling the cloud fraction of trade cumulus was much more important than fluctuations in ambient humidity, for instance. And then, when looking at cloud feedbacks in these regimes, what we've shown is that the models that were producing a very strong positive feedback of trade cumulus under warming were models that were representing the thermodynamical control of clouds, but they were not representing or not adequately representing the dynamical controls of clouds. So then it told us that the models that were predicting the strongest cloud feedbacks were probably less plausible than the other ones because they did not represent the primary process that controls the trade cumulus cloud fraction. And then if we go back to this result by Myers et al., showing that the models were representing this big spread, so now we think that the estimates at the lower bound are more credible than those ones, and we understand why there was such a large spread. But we still have to understand why the dynamical control of clouds makes the feedback so small. And we'll come back to that later. So then, more recently, other studies, in particular this assessment of climate sensitivity by Steve Sherwood, that was one of your students, right? showed that the high cloud feedback contributed increasingly to the uncertainty in cloud feedbacks across climate models. And that in particular the feedback from what we call anvil clouds. So anvil clouds are those beautiful clouds that form at the top of cumulonimbus convective towers in the tropics. And if we want to figure out the feedback that those clouds might produce in climate change, we have to figure out how their altitude, their area, their optical thickness might change in a warmer climate. And in this very early work by Ram and Augustsson, they were trying to anticipate to assess the climate sensitivity to increase CO2 using a single column model. And for this calculation, they needed to make some assumption about how the clouds would vary with warming. And they were wondering whether the high cloud would respond with a constant cloud top altitude or whether a constant cloud top temperature. And what they showed is that making one or the other assumption had a great impact on the climate sensitivity that was assessed by this model. And at that time, we didn't really know what was the right hypothesis. But now we do know, and that's one of the areas where a lot of progress has been done. In particular, thanks to this work by Dennis Hartmann at the University of Washington, showing that what controls the height of high-level clouds, of anvil clouds here, is very much controlled by what's going on where there are no clouds, so in the clear sky atmosphere around. And in particular, it's controlled very much by the vertical profile of clear sky radiative cooling rate that decreases very strongly with height in the upper troposphere. And this decrease relates to the fact that temperature decreases and therefore water vapor decreases as well due to the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And therefore the radiative cooling of the atmosphere decreases. And that decreases the magnitude of the subsidence in clear air. And that produces a clear mass convergence in the clear sky regions that has to be compensated at the same altitude by divergence in the cloudy areas. And basically, there's very simple physical arguments explain why the anvil clouds are always found around 12, 13 kilometers in the tropics. That's very robust, and that can be very well explained by the simple physical arguments. And so that tells us also something about how these clouds might react in a warmer climate. In a warmer climate, the isotherms will shift upward, and so we expect the cloud top height to also shift upward, but the cloud top temperature will remain nearly constant. So that's a strong constraint. An important piece of our understanding. But then what about the anvil cloud area, which can be very significant, as you can see on this picture? What we've shown is that using similar physical arguments, we can show that as the climate warms, the cloud top's height increases, but their area shrinks because the radiative divergence that I was mentioning earlier decreases with warming, mostly because of the increase of the upper tropospheric static stability. And so that's a mechanism that explains why in a warmer climate we expect having smaller anvil clouds areas. And this mechanism actually is supported by satellite observations. For instance, analyzing the Calypso space lidar observations shows that at the intra-annual timescale, when climate gets warmer, then we have an increase in the anvil cloud top height and a decrease in the anvil cloud area. It's also supported by cloud resolving model simulations. So we think it's kind of a robust mechanism. We could also show that the same mechanism explains the anvil cloud response to a wide variety of perturbations, including changes in surface temperature, like we can have during El Nino, for instance, but also changes in the CO2 content in the atmosphere, and even the response to explosive volcanic eruptions that warms the upper troposphere the changes petropospheric static stability and has an impact on the anvil clouds, which is a remote impact explained by these physical processes. But then what about the radiative feedback? Because we know that anvil clouds affect very strongly both the reflection of sunlight, but also the greenhouse effect, and how those two effects compensate. We've tried to address this using theory and satellite observations. And a postdoc, Breck McKim, working with me, showed that using just the theory and satellite observation, that the feedback associated with the changes of anvil areas with warming was very close to zero, so close to neutral. So that's also an important piece in our understanding of cloud feedbacks. But still there remain uncertainties about how the cloud optical thickness might change in a warmer climate. So how much the amount of cloud ice, for instance, could change, and there is still research on this subject. So what are the challenges now in this field? I already mentioned a few ones, but there are more. So this curve, that I think you'll see it several times today, because that's a big challenge for our understanding of the Earth radiation budget. We now have several decades of Earth radiation budget measurements, and those measurements show an increasing trend of the radiation budget by about 0.5 watt per meter square per decade. And the measurements seem to be quite robust. They agree quite well with independent measurements of the ocean heat uptake, heat content that you see also on this plot. So we think it's a real trend. And a few weeks ago, there was a workshop organized by Björn Stevens to try to figure out how to interpret this trend. And the outcome of this workshop is that it's still, well, the numbers still don't add up very well. It's clearly there is an impact of changes in the aerosol forcing. There is probably a contribution from cloud changes and so on, but we are not able to interpret this trend properly at the moment. And that really reminds us that we still have progress to make in our understanding of the Earth's radiation budget. And regarding our knowledge gaps, one of the gaps in our understanding of the impact of clouds on climate is on a particular scale, which we call the mesoscale. So it's a scale that is between a few kilometers to a few hundred kilometers. So it's a scale that is intermediate between the scale of an individual clouds and between what we call the large scale. And this is a scale where, if you look at satellite images, you see a lot of beautiful patterns of cloudiness, very various, very diverse, and very beautiful. And that's a scale for which really our knowledge is much less developed than the other ones. And I would like to illustrate some of the gaps we have and some of the challenges that relate to this mesoscale. So for instance, let's think of the stratocumulus. We've seen earlier that the models were strongly underestimating the feedback associated with stratocumulus. This is, well, no, here. This is an area close to the South American coast where we have a lot of stratocumulus. And this is a zoom on this region. And you see that the stratocumulus exhibit a lot of mesoscale structures and morphology. You have open cells, closed cells, for instance. And depending on the morphology of these clouds, the planetary albedo, of course, depends a lot on that. And there's been a lot of research already trying to understand these transitions between open and closed cells and understanding how stratocumulus respond to environmental conditions. But still, there are still many unknowns. And that's certainly one area where we need to do more progress, and maybe we'll better understand why the models fail to represent the low cloud feedback of these clouds. Another example is from the trade cumulus regimes. So it's, if you look at satellite imagery over the tropical Atlantic, for instance, during winter, you see it's covered by trade cumulus everywhere. But the trade cumulus can organize in many different ways at the mesoscale. And you have here the four prominent patterns of cloudiness that they can exhibit. It's, each region is about 1,000 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers. So we've given names to those different patterns. And what's interesting is that the amount of cooling associated with those low clouds, those different patterns, is quite different in this type of cloud organization that we call sugar, because it's associated with very tiny clouds, like sugar at the surface of the ocean. The cooling or the reflection of sunlight by these clouds is much weaker than when we have these huge cloud flowers, which are really low-level clouds, and they are 3 kilometers high at max. But they form this extensive stratiform cloudiness at the top, and they reflect solar radiation much more. So that's the way clouds, the straight cumulus clouds organized spatially impact the radiation budget quite a lot. And yet, if you look again at this plot, you see that observations suggest that the feedback associated with straight cumulus is very close to zero. And we know that, for instance, when surface temperature increases, observations suggest that we have more of this and less of this type of pattern. And so why is the feedback so small? And so here there's a gap in our understanding. We still have to figure out how those mesoscale patterns of cloudiness might change with warming and what will be the impact on the radiation budget. And if they don't change, we have to understand why. So using Eureka observations, we had so many observations that we could better understand how these different patterns of cloudiness form. And that's what we did. And we think we now, at least we have revealed an important process in the control of these different patterns of cloudiness. And we've shown that it was largely related to the behavior of boundary layer thermals, and the way the thermals, as they rise in the boundary layer, tend to merge and produce larger thermals and change the density of thermals. And so this interaction between the boundary layer and clouds above seems to be really very important in controlling the way the clouds organize spatially. But then we have now to understand how this organization might change in a warmer climate. And for this, work has to be done. If there are young scientists in the room, that's an interesting area of research. Another example, the mesoscale patterns of cloudiness are seen in low-level clouds, but they are also seen in deep convective regimes. And you have examples here. It's still over the Atlantic Ocean. You see that there are deep clouds forming over the ITCZ, which can organize sometimes in one band or two bands, and that can vary from day to day. And we can also find these big mesoscale convective systems here. So it's a type of organization of clouds that show that convection and clouds can cluster to different degrees and in different ways. And you can wonder whether that matters for climate or not. And what we've shown a few years ago, that actually that does matter probably for the Earth's radiation budget, because if you try to quantify the degree of clustering of deep clouds over the tropical belt, and you look at the relationship with the tropical mean radiation budget measured from space, you see that there is a strong anticorrelation between the two. So when convection is more clustered, on average, the atmosphere is drier. And that's also something that some cloud resolving models represent. And because of the atmosphere on average is drier, then there is more long-wave radiation emitted to space, and that cools the planet more efficiently. So then that tells us that we have to understand how this clustering of deep convection or deep clouds might evolve in a warmer climate. The other reason why understanding this cloud clustering matters is not only for the radiation budget, but also because it's been shown from models and observations that the degree of clustering of deep clouds also matters very much for the intensity of extreme precipitation. So that's another reason why we'd like to figure out how it will evolve in a warmer climate. And up to now, we were predicting climate change with models that did not represent the mesoscale organization of clouds because they did not have the horizontal resolution needed for that. But now things are starting to change. We now have a new generation of climate models simulating the atmosphere at the kilometer scale. And you have here an example for 2 different models simulating the atmosphere at the kilometer scale. And if you look closely at those simulations, you see that the way the cluster convection in these 2 models is quite different. This model, for instance, produces a much more strong clustering of deep convection than this one, where deep convection is more scattered. And so that means that we have to understand why those models produce those different organizations, how we could improve. They're not all right, probably, not in the same way. So we have to figure out what we should change in the models to improve that. And so we need to understand what controls this clustering at the process level. We can quantify the ability of these new models to represent the clustering, convective clustering. And here, this is an example from work from Émilie France in my group, where she's quantified the amount of clustering at the tropical scale using satellite observations. And she's compared the same thing from 2 different models, IFS and ICON, running at the kilometer scale. And you see that depending on the model versions, the models do more or less well. And in particular, there seems to be a strong dependence on the spatial resolution of the models here. If you look at global warming experiments performed with these models, we also find that there is a strong dependence on the change in aggregation with warming on the spatial resolution of these models. So clearly there's still progress to be done. We still need to improve those models. And for this, we need to go back to the process studies and understand what controls the organization of clouds. And it's an area of research which is developing very fast, and that has been extremely exciting during the last decade. In particular, because for a long time we thought that clouds were organizing where there were gradients in surface properties, for instance, or when there were atmospheric waves clustering convection. But then we've learned that clouds can cluster spontaneously just through the interaction between clouds and the environment or among clouds. And that's what we call the self-aggregation behavior of clouds. And that completely revolutionized the way we try to understand the collective behavior of clouds, and in particular the behavior of clouds at the mesoscale. And there are several processes which are thought to be important in this spontaneous organization of clouds. One process that we mentioned already is the interaction between the boundary layer and clouds, in particular the role of thermals and turbulence in the boundary layer. And we think that this interaction controls to some extent the cloud-based distribution, the cloud-based width distribution in particular. And since the 70s, we know that the size of clouds near their base controls to some extent the depth of clouds, the vertical development of clouds. And if the clouds grow enough, then they start precipitating, and then part of the precipitation re-evaporates during its fall, and that creates a pool of cold air that we call a cold pool that spreads out near the surface, and that lifts the air at the edge of this cold pool, and that creates other clouds. And so that's how you can explain those circular structures, for instance, that you can see from space around precipitating clouds. And so that's a way that clouds can interact with each other and create these beautiful patterns of cloudiness. And also another potentially important player in the organization of clouds at the mesoscale is the mesoscale circulation. So the circulations induced by clouds around them. The convective clouds transport the air upward, and so the air has to subside down. So they induce subsidence around them, but convective clouds also generate gravity waves around them. And for a long time, it was very difficult to measure these mesoscale circulations because they take place in the clear air, and it's very difficult to measure. But things are starting to change because now we manage from space to measure the clear sky vertical velocities looking at the time variations of the brightness, temperature, and the water vapor channel. And so we can measure here the clear sky vertical velocities in the mid-troposphere. And we can do this at a very high resolution, space and time resolution. And we can see very well that around the deep convective systems, we have an area with a very strong subsidence, very, very strong, much stronger than we thought it would be. We can see also a lot of mesoscale structures, in particular mesoscale gravity waves. And actually, if we make a spectrum of vertical velocity from this data, we see that the spectrum at the mesoscale is largely dominated by gravity waves. And so that's a completely new way of understanding the interaction between deep convection and the environment. And so for the first time, we can now start evaluating this in models, in kilometer scale models in particular, and better understand how this dynamical influences of deep clouds can play a role in the mesoscale organization of clouds. So we need now to understand how all these different processes that we think play an important role, how do they play all together and control at the end those different cloud mesoscale patterns. And that's for this reason that we've organized this orchestra field campaign, and the Maestro field campaign was a French component to it, over the tropical Atlantic. It was during the summer of 2024. And again, we had research aircraft, we had satellite measurements, we had soundings and so on. And we have great data now that we are currently analyzing. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to report some progress in our understanding of this. So I will stop here, just reminding that the role of clouds in climate remains an important area of research, very exciting one. We've understood many things, but there's still a lot that we don't understand yet. So it's still a very an exciting field of research. And I'd like to thank you, Ram, again for pioneering this adventure and for making this field so interesting and exciting. Yeah, thank you very much.